And for anybody who hasn't met me, I'm Matt Spinner. I'm Private Reserve Sake Specialist. I work with Private Reserve, which is obviously our employer, as well as World Sake Imports, which is our sake importer, right? So kind of like we talked about today's going to be a little bit of a choose your own adventure class, and we decided that we're just going to start from soup to nuts and get through the sake making process, and then we'll talk a little bit about our catalog, right? So I'm going to be working off of some notes that I put on my phone, so I hope that's not too much of an issue for anybody. It'll be relatively brief. I don't plan on being here all day. All right. So let's start with sake, the actual word, right? S-A-K-E. It's actually the same word for salmon in Japanese. So if you're ever at a sushi joint and you see sake listed under your nigiri, it's obviously salmon, right? You're not going to get, sake on a roll. We would call it, its formal term and kind of its legal term when we look at it in Japan is Nihonshu. Nihon is Japan. Right? That's what we call Japan, Nihon, right? And if you're Japanese, you don't say I'm from Japan, right? You say Nihon, right? And shu is alcohol, right? So anything shu, S-H-U is alcohol, right? So Nihonshu is Japan's native alcohol, right? Not a spirit, right? Also not a wine. Sometime in the 70s, we got on calling it rice wine, which is a ridiculous misnomer, right? Wine is made from, or fruit, right? Wine's made from fruit, beer is made from grain. So I like to say that if sake had to be anything, right, it's a clarified flat beer, right? It's a clarified flat beer. If it had to be anything, if we had to nail it down to anything, right, because it's brewed, right, and it's not distilled, right, if it had to be anything, right? Traditionally, sake was brewed, this is kind of just like the history of it, traditionally it was brewed by rice growers, right? And obviously sake masters, but like the people who did the brewing were the rice growers. You'd bring your rice crop into town, sell it to the sake brewer, and now your year is over for growing rice, right? But you still got a family to feed for the winter. So you'd stay in town and help brew the sake and see your rice all the way through to kind of its natural end into sake. There's a couple terms that you'll hear me throw around throughout this that are related to the brewery itself. We'll touch on those really fast, right? The brewery itself is called a kura, K-U-R-A, right? The people that work in the brewery are kurabito, right? Brewery workers. You just mash them together. It's almost like German. And the toji is the brewmaster. So if you hear me say like this toji or that toji, right? That's the brewmaster. And the thing about brewmasters is generally speaking, you'll work in a sake brewery for somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 to 40 years before you're kind of handed the reins. Right, so when we have a couple toji in Japan now that are in their 50s or early 60s, that's almost unheard of, right? That's really, really young. There's one guy that brews over there and he's 45, which is really, really wild. So there are some younger faces taking over. And traditionally, the breweries are passed down from generation to generation to generation. So a lot of the breweries we work with at WSI have been in the same family for 300-400 years, right? And a lot of them honestly function at a loss. Right, they do business in ceramics, so they also do business in electronics. They have a large business portfolio, but the sake brewery is kind of like the heart and soul. That's the thing that you keep going no matter what, if at all possible, right? So it's kind of like a really special thing in that way. There is a business side to it, but it's so much culture and so much family there. Another thing that we talk about with sake, again working from my notes, is I know in wine, terroir and vintage means so much to us, right? Means so much. What year was it? What's the soil like? What's the wind like? You know what I mean? That means almost nothing to us in sake, right? We have no vintages. There are no vintages. The goal is consistency year over year over year, right? And Akitabare Junmai in 2007 should taste exactly the same as an Akitabare Junmai in 2004. You know what I mean? Obviously not had it sat for 17 years, right? But at its peak when it was brewed, they should taste exactly the same, right? Which is why it takes 40 years of working in a brewery to be the toji, because you have to manipulate every single different rice crop, every single different year to be the exact same thing year over year. And that's kind of the art of sake brewing. All right. So any questions about any of that? Hit me.
Are there any expiration dates then to it? Do you have to drink it over a certain time?
We'll get there.
Okay.
Yes. The answer is yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. We'll get there. Let's kind of start with what makes sake, because there are some key ingredients here to every single sake, right? Rice, water, koji, and yeast. and lactic acid in some way, shape, or form, which acts as a buffer for the yeast, right? It provides them like a nice habitat to live in so they don't get overtaken by other microbes, right? And if you asked any Toji what the most important part of his brewing process was, he would tell you all of that. He would say, there is nothing that can slack. The rice has to be what I need the rice to be. The water has to be the water that it has to be. The yeast needs to be hand selected, and the koji has to be grown perfectly, right? We'll start with the rice, which I'll ask you to refer down to the sheet in front of you, right? We'll start with, everybody's eating rice, everybody knows what rice is. Sake rice is completely different varietal, right? There's one varietal that we use more than anything, and that's called Yamada Nishiki, YamadaniShiki, Yamada Nishiki. That's like the king of sake rice. More brewers use Yamada Nishiki than any other singular rice. Yamada. Ada. Nishiki. Nishiki. 9 times out of 10 with Japanese, if you just spell it phonetically, you're right.
Okay, that's just the type of rice.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a varietal of rice. Just like we have varietals of grapes, we have varietals of rice, and they all perform in different ways. But one of the resounding factors through all of them is that what makes them different than table rice, right? And this is why milling is so important. Is on your table rice, the reason rice tastes delicious is because your fat, your protein, and your carbohydrates, which is your 3 macronutrients, are all kind of interwoven in that grain of rice. They all kind of lay on each other, equally dispersed in that grain of rice. In sake rice, the center, the core of the rice is almost all carbohydrates, right? Whereas the outer layers are, generally speaking, more fatty and more protein, right? And when we're fermenting, we can't ferment fats and protein. If we ferment fats and protein, we get rotten flavors, right? Fermented fat does not sound good to anyone here. Fermented protein is literally rotten meat, right? So when we mill away the fats and the protein from the outside kernel of the rice, right? So that's what the milling process is, right? And we'll get back to that a little bit later when we start talking about sake styles and why the milling process is important, but we'll move on from there, right? Water is wildly important. This is really the only play that sake could make at the importance of any type of terroir, right? Sake breweries are set up on clean water sources. Generally speaking, we're talking about mountain runoff, mountain stream, springs. There are sake breweries that have where the spring water comes into the brewery in the basement of the brewery, and that's the water that they use. There are also sake breweries that have moved because of earthquakes or fires or whatever, who pay good money to have the water that they've used for 200 years filled up and carted up to them at their new location, because the water at the location that they're in now isn't the same as the old water, right? So that water is so important. It can be hard or it can be soft, and that's going to kind of dictate not so much the flavor but the feel on the palate. You know what I mean? A softer water is obviously going to be a little bit more smooth, a little bit more chewy, right? A harder water is obviously going to bring more of a mineral content, a little higher salinity, right? Because that's what a hard water is. It has more minerals in it, right? And this is very much speaking to the terroir of it. This is where the kind of, if it grows together, it goes together mentality that works in wine also works in sake as well, right? Which we'll touch back later when we start talking about pairings a little bit. The next most important thing would be koji, right? Koji is a naturally occurring mold, right? It's Aspergillus oryzae is the name of the mold. Not that you'll ever need to know that, but the thing that you'll need to know about koji and what makes it so special is we don't need, anytime we were ever going to brew or distill or ferment a grain, the very first step is malting it, right? Anybody like scotch? A single malt scotch, right, is all grain that was malted in that single year, right? And generally speaking, when we malt it, we get it wet, we get it warm, and we let it sprout, right? That's why scotch is smoky, right? Because it goes into big malt houses where there's a fire burning to keep it warm, and it gets covered in peat moss to keep it wet, right? That's why scotch is peaty and smoky, because you have to malt those grains. Because what happens when grains malt is starches convert to sugars, right? We can't ferment starches, they'll just rot. We have to ferment sugars in order to get alcohol. Koji is really special, right? Because at an enzymatic level, it converts starches to sugars, right? So we can make starch conversion happen, sugar conversion happen, without needing to malt the grain. And koji is naturally occurring on rice stalks, right? And over the years, brewers realized, right, that hey, when we use the rice that already has this like weird mold on it, we get really good sake. And if we use the rice that doesn't have the weird mold on it, it all just goes to hell, right? And it all just molds, right? And the way that we introduce koji nowadays is we steam the rice. All rice used in sake making has been previously steamed. We never use raw dry rice, right? So we steam the rice and then we inoculate it with koji spores, right? Just like you would grow a mushroom with spores, you grow koji with spores.
Car parked in front of the gateway.
We inoculate it with koji, right? And from there, we can use it to then ferment, right? And the last thing we'll touch on is yeast. We obviously need yeast to convert those sugars into alcohol, right? Just like we would in the brewing process, just like we would in wine, right? We get the koji to convert the starch to sugars. We get the yeast to convert the sugars to alcohol. Thusly, we can all have a really fun night out at the sushi restaurant, right? The special thing about yeast in sake brewing is that it's grown in special labs, right? And you essentially buy packets of yeast. Some breweries use naturally occurring yeast because they've been brewing there for 400 or 500 years. So it's growing in the rafters and it's growing on all of the tools. You know what I mean? There are breweries that can function like that. But most breweries introduce yeast. They're all numbered, right? And you'll never have to remember yeast number 12 or yeast number 14. That's geeky, nerdy stuff for guys like me. But the important thing about yeast is that it's 90% of the nose of sake. When you smell sake, 90% of that nose is designed by that yeast, right? What the yeast eats, right? And the way it eats and the way it off gases is what gives you the nose on sake. And fun fact, a large portion of the yeasts that we use in sake brewing, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 60%, don't quote me on that, were discovered on wildflowers, right? So you have a whole section of the Japanese government devoted, right, to sake research. So they're going out finding new yeasts all the time. And they've realized over the years that yeast that work really well in sake brewing come from wildflowers. Why? I have no idea, right? I don't know what is special about wildflowers. That's just a fact that we know. All right, so when we talk about the brewing itself, right? So we've got steamed rice inoculated with koji. We've got yeast ready to go in. We've got our beautiful water coming from a mountain spring, right? Now we have to put it all together. And this is kind of what's really awesome about sake is if we were brewing beer, all of those different steps would happen in different tanks, right? It goes from the mash tank, ends up in the shiny tank, goes through filtration, goes for probably a secondary firm for a carbonation, right? It all happens in different tanks. In sake, while the tanks may grow in size, what starts in the first small tank ends in the last large tank, right? And this together, always, right? And this is what we call in sake, in our jargon, we call it multiple parallel fermentation, which is what makes sake so cool, is because if you are like me and kind of are a science nerd, it's really cool special microbiology. It's really, really, really cool. So in a day of brewing, you wake up in the morning, steam some rice, right? That rice goes into a tank, right, with koji, with water, and with yeast, and with some lactic acid, and does its thing. Rinse, repeat, do it again the next day. And when that batch gets too big to be in that tank, goes to another tank, right? When that batch gets too big, goes to another tank. Hit me.
So all that together, then you rinse it?
No, I meant like rinse, repeat, like do it all again the next day. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, like rinse, repeat, like do it all again the next day. So if you were staying at a hotel next to a sake brewery and you woke up in the morning around 4 or 5 a.m., you would smell rice steaming. Because the very first thing we do every day is steam rice in order to feed the moromi, right? In order to feed that fermentation mash. And that essentially is sake. From there, we press it, strain it, filter it, pasteurize it, put it in bottles, put it in shipping containers, send it to Hawaii, right? And then send it to us, right? So does that cover, everybody gets how sake is made? Hit me with questions.
How do you spell koji?
Koji. Yeah. And there's when we say koji, what we mean, this was confusing for me when I first started studying sake. When we say koji, what we mean is rice that has been inoculated with Aspergillus oryzae spores. If we say koji kin, K-I-N, which means like powder, that means the actual spores themselves, right? So when we're talking about koji, if you hear me or anyone say koji, it's rice that's been inoculated with Aspergillus oryzae. All right? So that's how we make sake. Everybody got it? Phenomenal. Let's talk about rice and styles of sake, right? There's a really important word that I'm going to spell for you
Thank you.
because this is also one of the most confusing parts of sake, and I don't know why they made it so confusing, but I've broken it down in a way that's pretty readily understandable, right? When we talk about the different grades of sake, from Futsushu all the way up to your Junmai Daiginjos, right? All of that is delineated by milling the rice down, right? And there's a word that we use called Saimai Buai. S-E-I-M-A-I-B-U-A-I. Saimai Buai, right? And what that basically means to us, right, is the percentage of the kernel of rice that's left over after we mill it. Why we don't just do how much rice we've milled off, I will never understand. Never will I understand that. It will never make sense to me, right? But when we talk about milling sake, all sake starts with brown rice, right? It starts with brown rice. So the first thing we have to do is mill the husk off, right? We have to mill the husk off. And if we just mill the husk off and just get white rice, right, we get to our Futsushi level, right? After that, there is no polishing ratio necessary, or milling ratio, I should say, Saimai Buai ratio necessary for Junmai. There used to be, but there isn't anymore. You can make a Junmai with straight up white rice that you've just taken the husk off of. When we get to Ginjo, right, which is our first kind of premium level of sake, right? We get to Ginjo, our Saimai Buai is 60%, right? That means we've milled 40% of the grain of rice away. And the way that we mill are in big, giant, conical shaped rice mills that are tilted slightly on an angle, and they rotate. And they rotate very, 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 very slowly, right? And out the bottom comes our nuka, or basically rice flour. You know, if you go buy rice flour from the store, that's a byproduct of sake making, right? We mill that away. If there are lots of very good Wagyu beef farms in Japan that feed their cows rice flour or nuka, right? Because it's nutritious. We're milling away the fat and the protein right from the outside. It's very nutritious, right? And it makes cows taste really good, right? But it doesn't ferment so well for us to make sake, right? So when you see those numbers, 60%, that's what's left. That's that Saimai Buai. That's what's left after we mill. It took me probably a year of studying sake to really like get a good handle on that. We can move up one more to our Daiginjo level, right? That starts at 50%. That means we've taken away 50% of that grain of rice and then started to steam it, grow koji on it, and go through that whole process of making sake. And you can start to begin to see when we start talking about milling why sake, premium sake, is a premium price, right? Because if we harvested, 10 acres of grapes, right? And then immediately threw away 5 acres worth of grapes, but needed to make the same amount of money as 10 acres of grapes, right? We cut our yield in half, we'd have to double the price. That's the only way you could do it. You have to double the price because you have to make that much money, right? So that's why premium sake commands a premium price, because essentially what we're doing is we are selling 50% of our product, of our original product. We're taking 50% of that and essentially getting pennies on the dollar for it by selling it as nuka or rice flour, right? But what that does, as we mill it away, we get closer to that carbohydrate shimpaku center, right? What that does is it's going to give us a more refined flavor, right? A cleaner, more refined, lighter, brighter flavor in our sake, right? So we'll do styles one more time. Start with Futsushu. Futsushu, table sake, right? And one point that I want to stress here, let me stop for a second. One point that I want to stress is, even though this is shaped like a pyramid and we're kind of led to believe that the top of the pyramid is the best, right? That is not the case. There are incredible Futsushus, there are incredible Hanjozos, there are incredible Junmais, just like there are terrible Daiginjos, right? It's not a qualitative expression, the pyramid. It's a quantitative expression of how much rice is left over and how much of that sake is made. Because Daiginjo is very expensive to make, right? Because you have to mill it away and because it's kind of temperamental, right? You have to control a lot of things to get there. So don't think Daiginjo best, right? Don't think Daiginjo best. Now, is competition level sake always a Daiginjo? Yes. Yes, it is. But just because it's competition level doesn't mean it's the best. You know what I mean? It just doesn't. It's just what we've decided over the years is the hardest to make. And if you're going to have a competition for something, you might as well make it the thing that's the hardest thing to do. Hit me.
So when it says no milling is required, or minimal, is there ever one that's never milled?
Is there a brown rice sake? No.
Just say no.
Okay.
No. Well, it has been attempted, right? But there's nothing for when we have that husk that's on brown rice. When you eat brown rice, the reason it's brown is because there's a husk on the outside of it, right? And that husk is all fiber, right? So there's no way for our koji or our yeast to get into that. You know what I mean? And that's actually one of the hardest parts of milling is when we mill, the reason it's not labor intensive because they're electronic now, but the reason it's so time consuming is because we have to do it at a slow speed so we don't break the kernels of rice apart because we want all the koji and the yeast to grow exactly the same over every single kernel of rice. And we're talking hundreds of millions of kernels of rice to get it to grow the same. Yeah, so no brown rice sake. Not any that's worth anything anyways. But no milling percentage is exactly what I mean when I say that is I've had really good junmai that was 80%. They only milled away 20% of it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it was incredible junmai. It's all about what the toji can do with that rice.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that's the art of it. That's the thing that makes it so special. That's the thing that makes World Sake Import so special is we only pick one toji from each prefecture. And generally speaking, it's the best one in that prefecture, you know? We'll move up to Tokubetsu Junmai, which we talked about. Tokubetsu means special, right? We kind of talked about what that means, right? That means I already have a Junmai that we offer, and we can't offer two Junmais because that's just going to confuse the market. We can't have the same brewery. You couldn't have Bud Light release also Bud Light and spell it out. You know what I mean? They would just confuse the market, right? But you can absolutely have Bud Light Seltzer, or Bud Light Lime, or Bud Light Grapefruit, or whatever they do nowadays. You know what I mean? So that Tokubetsu, right, delineates that while it may be milled to the same percentage as another sake, there are Tokubetsu Daiginjos, there are Tokubetsu Ginjos, right? It delineates that it's milled to the same percentage as that Junmai or that Ginjo from that brewery, but it's a little different. Maybe they use a different yeast. Maybe they ferment it a different way. Maybe they use naturally occurring lactobacillus bacteria instead of dumping, lactic acid in it, right? That Tokubetsu just means special.
So like we would think about it with wine, it'd be like a reserve wine.
That's exactly right.
Like from
That is
or with single vineyard, maybe.
that is exactly right. Yeah, not necessarily single vineyard, but reserve. Yes, something special, right? Which is why Tokubetsu literally translates to special, right? Yes, reserve would be a great way to put that. That's exactly right. This is our cab. This is our reserve cab. You know what I mean? And again, it's not a greater than, less than. You know what I mean? It's not like, well, the Tokubetsu is always better, just like the reserve is always better, right? Exactly right. Great way to put it. Thank you for that. All right, then we get to Ginjo, 60%, Daiginjo, 50%, right? Any questions on sake making or milling as it stands right now? Yeah, if you got them, hit me. I'm here.
I have a question.
Yes.
I always get confused. What's the difference between Junmai, Ginjo, and just regular Ginjo?
Yeah, great question.
The milling is the same.
Excellent question. So if you look at the right side of what I've given you, right? Junmai, we went over, means pure rice. So a Junmai Ginjo will not have brewer's alcohol added, while a Ginjo will.
No.
Right? A Daiginjo will have brewer's alcohol added, whereas a Junmai Daiginjo will not. Right? And those can be two very different sake. I mean, there are breweries that make a Ginjo and a Junmai Daiginjo, and they taste very different. And it's not even like, oh, if you have a discerned palate, you can really taste the difference. It is markedly different. The flavor profile, the nose, and especially the mouthfeel, with or without brewer's alcohol added. And again, that's like 0.7%. It's nothing, it's not gonna fortify at all. It's not gonna take you from a 14 to 16 where we normally see sake live up to like an 18 or 19. It's almost no bump. All right. Anything else before we move a little bit along? Does everybody feel good about how sake is made? Good. That means I'm doing my job. All right, the next thing we'll touch on before we taste is, and this is one that's for you, but it's also for your customers, right, is label reading, right? I know that that's a thing that we all struggle with, right? You look at this beautiful label right here, right? How are you supposed to know that that says Sohomare Tokubetsu Kimoto? You don't, right? That's why we at World Sake Imports have paid lots and lots and lots of money to design that side, right?
I'm grateful for that.
They're the same on all of our bottles, right? They have the same format. They have a little blurb about what it does, what it is, how it tastes, maybe even what it pairs with, right? We give them all English names, right? And it used to drive Mike crazy because I would text him and be like, I need 1 case of Akitabare. And he'd be like, dude, I don't know what that is. I'm like, oh, I need Northern Skies.
English.
I need a case of Northern Skies. Yeah, sorry. But that being said, right, that's really important, right? The name really works, and we try really hard at WSI to give them either just a direct translation, right, of something meaningful to the sake, or, you know what I mean, like this one, this Kimoto, we call Heart and Soul. That's kind of like, it's a reference to how hard the sake is to make, this particular style. You really got to put your heart and soul into it to make that sake. It is not an easy sake to make, right? So we have the name up top, underneath that, or we have the brewery, right? And then the style, Tokubetsu Kimoto, right? And then the name of it underneath, and then a blurb. And then what we've done, which is really great, is if you look at the very bottom, right? It says 2306 down there, right? We used to function in this world of what we call brewery years. A brewery year, you're gonna have to follow me down a weird rabbit hole here, right? A brewery year goes from July 1st to June 30th. We generally release sake in October, right? October is International Sake Month. That's generally when we release sake in October, right? So in the fall, this is kind of when sake comes out. After the harvest, right? It kind of like follows the seasons, right? We run that brewery year for that year basically because of Imperial Japan. It's when the emperor took power, right? And when another emperor would take power, right? And there's a story history behind it. And it used to be that you look at it and it would say BY, right? Brewery year, and then just the year. And you would basically infer that that sake was released and bottled somewhere around the fall of that year, right? But if you didn't know that, you wouldn't know that. You know what I mean? So what we've done is we've put a more Western date system on there now. So it says 2306, right? So that sake was put in that bottle and released in June of 2023, right? So that pretty much covers your label reading. I encourage clients that aren't super familiar with sake to stock them backwards, right? Because when you have bartenders and servers that look, these look beautiful. That looks beautiful facing that way, right? But if you have bartenders and servers that don't know what those are and aren't familiar with those, then they're going to be poking around in there forever. I've had clients pour the wrong sake for me when I was there, right? Because it was facing this way. And I would use that opportunity to say, you know, if you just spin those around and stock them like that, right? And generally speaking, right, when we stock our sake, it's in a lowboy cooler. You know what I mean? Generally not lit up. It's behind the bar. So it doesn't really matter. You know what I mean? And if you love the labels, which we love, we spend a lot of money designing those front labels too. Take a bottle when it's empty, put the lid back on it, and put those up on your back bar. Yeah. You know what I mean? And then people can point at those and look at those and ask about that. You know what I mean? And then you can say, oh, you know what? Oh, yeah, I do have that one. That's the Sohomare Tokubetsu Kimoto Heart and Soul. It's a classic rendition of the ancient Kimoto style. Right?
Craft breweries do that with till 4-packs. They try to face the label and then the back of it.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. For that reason, exactly, right? So it's much more approachable because this, for your average Western consumer, wildly unapproachable.
Right.
But I speak that language, right? So I wanted to get you guys a little bit hip to reading those labels as well and checking those dates. Now, to get to your point, we'll talk about dates briefly. Sake, because of the way it's produced, doesn't have any sulfates or sulfites, right? So it's more like a natural wine, right, than it is a wine that we would cellar. And we follow some pretty loose guidelines on sake consumption because the answer for everything, almost everything in the sake world, when you ask me a question, is going to be, well, it depends. You know, well, what about this? Well, it depends. You know, well, what about this Junmai? Well, yeah, depends, right? So by style of sake, it depends on length of consumption, right? On one end of the spectrum, we have something like, let's talk about something in our catalog. We'll say Heaven of Tipsy Delight, right? Which is a Daiginjo, right? That's aged for 2 years at 0 degrees Celsius, right? That should be kept as cold as humanly possible for as long as humanly possible before consumption. Not for as long as humanly possible, but for as cold as possible for its entire lifespan. That really should never see the outside of a fridge, right? Because it's meant to be consumed cold and crisp, right? It's aged cold and crisp, and the flavor profile of it is bright citrus notes and bright apple notes and bright anise notes, right? So we want to really accentuate those by having it cold, right? Now we could go to the other end of the spectrum, and I'll use something that's not in our catalog, right? But there is a category of aged sake that we can age up to 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, right? It's being aged at room temperature, right? There are even some sake, there are some toji that age it at fluctuating temperatures. They'll age it in tank, right? And they won't control. So when we're brewing sake, we always control the temperature because we have to control how the yeast eat. Too hot, they eat too fast. Too cold, they eat too slow, right? Both can lead to spoilage, right? When we age this aged sake, there's one brewer that I know that just ages it in a warehouse where it gets cold in the winter and hot in the summer, right? So by the time you get that, it's already seen so many temperature fluctuations. It's already 5 years old. You could just leave that out on your counter and you're not going to see any negative repercussions at all. To pick a sake from our portfolio that you could pretty much beat up, 3 Dots. 3 Dots, which comes in the 900 mil, right? That can pretty much, I don't ever want to say do whatever you want to it because the Toji is a friend of mine and he would not like me to say that, but you could pretty much do whatever you want with it. It's not going to go anywhere. It's nice, it's sturdy, it's cinnamon and grain and oak, and those flavors are going to do really well at room temperature. You're never really going to lose anything, because that's the thing with sake is why, while we want to consume it within about 3 weeks of it opening, I have, and being refrigerated, I've never let a bottle of sake sit open for 3 weeks in my life. Not ever. Even ones that I put in the back of the fridge and I told myself that I was going to see what it tasted like in 3 weeks, I still drank it in like 2 days.
It would still last for like 3 weeks if it was kept cold.
Absolutely. Yep. And that's a large part of the reason why I put screw caps on and not corks, right? So we can limit that oxidization, because really the enemy to sake is oxidization. You know what I mean? So that's why I really love, if at all possible, for our clients to be able to store them upright, right? Because sideways, right, we've got a bunch of surface area, right, exposed to oxygen inside of the bottle, so oxidization is going to happen at a much more rapid rate once they're opened. I really like them stored upright, but that gets a little ticky-tacky. You know what I mean? But yeah, 3 weeks is about it, and it depends on the sake. And what it's not going to do if you drink it on the 4th week, it's not going to be off, right? It's not going to taste off, right? It's just going to be dull. You know, and if I paid good money for a beautiful Daiginjo and I tuck into it and it's a little dull and muted, I'm gonna be like, oh, I don't know why I'm drinking this right now. This is not the sake that I wanted. You know what I mean? Another thing is, does it breathe? Yes, it does breathe. Also, depends on the sake. Do I want it to breathe? Maybe I do. Maybe I don't. You know what I mean? Maybe I want it to stay nice and tight and not get it really aerated, right? Maybe I want to open it up. Depends on the sake, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we start tasting. Any other questions about anything?
So would you say 90% of the sake we carry would be better kept cold?
Yes.
Once it's open?
95%.
Okay. So, and then this is one that, maybe depends. Would you serve sake cold all the time, or do you serve it warm?
So,
You know what I'm
so
saying.
yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. And if you would have asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have pointed my nose up in the air and I would have said, warm sake is terrible and premium sake should always be drank cold, at the very least room temperature. But to be honest with you, the older I get, the more I like warm sake. And here's the thing that I realized. A lot of times in America, you don't get warm sake. You get hot sake. I don't want hot sake, right? Alcohol starts to evaporate at what, like 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 114 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere in that neighborhood? Why are you serving me hot sake? My alcohol's evaporated before you gave it to me. It's gonna take me forever to get drunk off this stuff. You know what I mean? Like, that being said,
Maybe that's the point.
maybe,
You have to
yeah.
buy more.
That being said, there is something that happens with warming sake, and this is why it is so popular. And I'm not making digs at anybody here. This is just facts. You can cover up poorly made sake and the flaws that are palatable in poorly made sake by warming it.
Yeah.
You can take a poorly made sake and warm it up and serve it, and it's going to taste a lot more pleasant than had I drank it at room temperature or cold. All right, so that's why you see those kind of like large boxes of sake get loaded into machines. I'm not drinking that cold. You out of your mind? Right? That being said, if we are selling to clients, right, that don't have a big dumb machine, right? Warm sake is beautiful. And I pick sake for warming the same way that we would pick wine for mulling, right? It's starting to get cold outside, right? It's starting to be mulled wine season. If I said, hey, I'm having everybody over tonight, we're gonna roast a whole hog and we're gonna do Brussels sprouts and sage stuffing, we're gonna mull wine, right? What wine am I picking? Yeah, a red, a entry-level red.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I'm gonna put star anise in it and I'm gonna put cloves in it and I'm gonna put whatever in it to mull it, right? I'm not gonna pick a Pinot Grigio, right? It'd be gross. Nobody wants to drink warm Pinot Grigio with cloves in it. I mean, I guess somebody does, but I certainly do not, right? Right? So that's why we wouldn't pick a Daiginjo to warm, but we would pick something like a Heart and Soul. It's beautiful warm. A Three Dots is beautiful warm. They're gorgeous because they have grainy, chestnutty, cinnamon flavors kind of already imbued into them that really shine when they get a little bit of warmth to them.
So what is warm?
So I used to do mine, we would run a circulator, right? We'd run a circulator at 117 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And we'd put the bottle in, and you have to be careful with this because you have to move it a little bit, right? We put the bottle in with the cap on, right? We've never had a cap pop off when it's a screw top, but on the little plugs, it can happen, right? Because the alcohol will start to evaporate. That being said, the sake that we would choose to warm almost always has a screw top on it. So anywhere between like 100 Fahrenheit to 114 degrees Fahrenheit. And from there, we go into a warmed ceramic container, right? So you get a warm container with warm sake in it, not hot sake, right? It should never be tea hot when it gets to you. It should be warm. And there are very few things that I like more than a warm sake on like a cold and blustery, terrible Cleveland winter day.
So when you do that, how does it compare to if I go to a sushi restaurant and I happen to like the warm sake that comes from the bar? Is there a big difference between your warming and what the product that they're serving?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The answer to that, I would kind of like revert to a coffee shop to give you a little bit of an insight, because I think coffee is probably something that everybody at this table is familiar with, right? So the process that we would use to warm sake in one of my restaurants is a little bit more like a pour over, right? It's going to be a little bit more delicate of a treatment of the sake or of the coffee grounds, right? We're going to steep them, we're going to bloom them, we're going to kind of pitch the first 50 mils of water, 100 mils of water that go through it, and then we'll pour it over again, right? It's going to preserve the quality of those grounds, right? Sake machines that get boxes loaded into the top, it's like a Keurig machine.
Okay.
Right? So it doesn't warm the box. It just drops sake through, runs it through a heating chamber to get it hot, and then puts it down the bottom. You know what I mean? So it's more like a Keurig machine, or like remember those old school coffee machines we used to have in like subway stations and like hockey rinks? You know what I mean? You just hit the button and the cup would pop down and like, right? And it just started as like water, condensed milk, and like coffee powder, and it pushed it through that. That's almost much more what those kind of like box load. Now, that being said, the profit margins are great on those, and we can't compete with that, right? We can't compete with the profit margins on box sake if that's what people like. And listen, to be honest with you, the more sake we sell writ large, boxed or otherwise, the more sake we sell, right? The more that they sell that, the more that they'll buy ours. So I'm not here to bash any sake at all, right? And any of it at all. I just prefer a gently warmed glass of sake that brings the flavors that I want to have in it, as opposed to a box-loaded machine. Does that answer your warm sake question?
Yeah,
Sick.
so, yeah,